This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 371 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. I'm not a big rankings guy. I think there's a lot more to fantasy football than putting guys in a rankings list and saying, here, just use this and draft. It's not a way to win in a sustainable way. But I do think from a content perspective, rankings are helpful. Even if I get annoyed by how some people consume rankings, I know that creating them and giving detail around them can be helpful to anyone who may not be looking at this stuff as much as I am. So today, I'm going to talk rankings. I'm going to walk through my rookie rankings while explaining why I have guys ranked where I have them ranked. It's pretty straightforward, but hopefully you can walk away from this episode feeling more confident when thinking about this year's rookie class. Now, before digging in, I want to let you guys know that FanDuel Sportsbook is now available in Colorado. That's pretty cool. But what's a sportsbook with no sports? Well, it's FanDuel Anything Book, FanDuel's newest free game. Each day you'll pick one free prop, like the weather, stocks, anything. Pick it right to win $5 in site credit. Then play again tomorrow. Play FanDuel Anything Book free only on FanDuel Sportsbook. Must be 21 years or older, max bonus of $50. Visit FanDuel.com/audio for terms. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-522-4700. So instead of separating all this analysis today by player, I think it might be more helpful to talk in terms of tiers. You guys can see the more laid out version of these rankings over on Numberfire, where I break things down and give analysis on each player. And I still want to give analysis, but I want to talk more draft strategy on today's show to give everything more context. Now in tier 1, and this is in non-Superflex leagues, I've got Clyde Edwards-Helaire and Jonathan Taylor. Joe Burrow is in this tier in Superflex leagues, and I'm totally fine with taking Burrow at the 101 in Superflex drafts if you need a quarterback. But let's talk about CEH and Jonathan Taylor. After night 1 of the draft, I tweeted how I couldn't comprehend who else would be the 101 in rookie drafts after Clyde Edwards-Helaire went to Kansas City. It was a perfect fit. He had the third best final season reception share in this class while playing on the best offense in college football last year. He's probably the best pass catching back in this class, and now he gets to play with Patrick Mahomes during his peak NFL seasons. It's hard to find a better pairing than that. But as you guys know, Jonathan Taylor was my RB1 heading into the draft, and the Colts traded up to get him, and it's also a really, really good landing spot, at least in the short term. The Colts offensive line is really good, to the point where their running backs actually ranked first in the NFL in success rate last year, according to Numberfire's expected points model. So Taylor shouldn't have any issues running behind that line. Like I said in last week's mailbag show, I think he's my favorite to be the best fantasy back in year 1 among this rookie group because of the Colts' willingness to trade up and the fact that they have an aging Phillip Rivers under center. They don't just want to hold Jonathan Taylor back. There are some question marks about his pass catching, and that's a big reason why I have CEH ahead of Taylor in these rankings. If you're in a PPR league, CEH is your choice. If it's a standard league, I think there's at least a discussion, which is why they're in the same tier here. My tier 2 is just one player, and that one player is J.K. Dobbins. I had Dobbins, CEH, and Cam Akers in one giant tier pre-draft, but Dobbins and Edwards-Helaire's landing spots pushed them ahead of where I had them before the draft started. The fit here in Baltimore is perfect for Dobbins. There's a great tweet from FantasyPoints.com's Graham Barfield that says it all. Graham tweeted last week, quote, "No running back in the rookie class is more accustomed to RPO reads than J.K. Dobbins. A class-high 57% of Dobbins' 2020 attempts were on run-pass options. The Ravens easily led the NFL in RPO attempts last year with 230. So you get to associate your running back with a quarterback who's bound to open lanes for his running backs. Last season, Ravens backs were 9th in success rate, 8th in fantasy points scored, and 1st in yards per carry. There's some worry about how big of a workload Dobbins will get in year 1, but he has just as high of a ceiling as CEH and Jonathan Taylor because of this landing spot. I've just got him in tier 2 because I'm more concerned of a split with him moving forward than the other two guys. Now, tier 3 has 4 players, 2 running backs and 2 wide receivers. The 2 backs are DeAndre Swift and Cam Akers, and to be honest, I don't really care how you rank the two. I put Swift ahead of Akers in my rankings, but I can flip-flop them pretty easily since Akers probably has more short-term volume upside. I've talked enough about both of those backs on this show. My comp for Swift is Miles Sanders, and my comp for Akers is a more complete Marlon Mack. Both players are great. Now, in my head, Akers has more short-term value, whereas Swift, with draft capital, is the better back in my model. But Akers is in the 88th percentile, while Swift is 92nd, giving them good odds to hit. It's just hard to ignore the landing spot and player combinations of the other three backs in this class, the big three backs, which is why, to me, Swift and Akers are in a tier below the other three. But if you want to go wide receiver here, I'm all for that as well, as long as you're taking CeeDee Lamb or Jerry Jeudy. Jeudy ranks as the best wideout in this class according to my prospect model, ranking in the 97th percentile of all wide receivers who were drafted or went to the combine since 2006. The hit rate historically for the 97th percentile or better wide receivers is very high. 10 of the 12 players in my model that rank higher than Jeudy in overall prospect score over the last 10 years have had at least one top 20 season in fantasy football. A lot of them have had multiple top 20 seasons, like Julio Jones, Demaryius Thomas, OBJ, AJ Green, and Dez Bryant. I'm not overly concerned about the landing spot for Jeudy either. He's a great complementary piece for Courtland Sutton, and in today's game, we see flatter target distribution than we used to. It's very possible for Sutton and Jeudy to be sort of a Julio and Calvin Ridley pair for years to come. If Drew Lock is good, then Jeudy will be even better. But Lamb is my wide receiver 1 now, despite being a 95th percentile wideout in my model, whereas Judy's in the 97th percentile. People may hate on the landing spot, but like I said on the show last week, Amari Cooper isn't a lock to be a Cowboy past 2021. And guys, what if CeeDee Lamb is just flat out better than Amari Cooper and Michael Gallup? That's most definitely in his range of outcomes. At the very least, he's going to take on the role that Randall Cobb had last year in the slot that got Cobb almost 15% of Dallas's targets. The short-term output for Lamb is not nearly as bad as people might think playing alongside two really good wide receivers. And the long-term potential is through the roof. If you have a top 6 pick in a single quarterback league rookie draft, you should be feeling pretty good. I'd say that's the case for the top 8 or 9 in Superflex rookie drafts. And then you just hit wide receiver city. But I do think 2 wide receivers stand out to be good enough to have their own tier at picks 8 and 9, and that's Jalen Reagor and Justin Jefferson. Both players were my wide receiver 3 and 4 pre-draft, so there's no movement there. But they both ended up in pretty strong situations, and they have the draft capital to back up the pre-draft ranking. They're just below Lamb in my prospect model, but not by much. Reagor had a top 6 stat score in my model within this draft class. And while people want to talk about his bad production last year, Pro Football Focus charted him with just 30.7% of his targets last year being accurate. That was the 4th lowest in college football. He's got a kick and punt return profile, and even though I think his year 1 opportunity might not be as good as others might think, 2021 and beyond is looking really good for Jalen Reagor. The Eagles have screwed up wide receiver picks in the past, but I loved this one. With Justin Jefferson, he had one of the highest floors in this class as a slot receiver in the NFL. He'll play that role right away with enough upside to move all over the field. But during his final collegiate season, we only saw him play out wide on 5 snaps, according to PFF. He is in a run-first offense, but there aren't many pass-catching options in Minnesota in 2020. That makes Jefferson a good bet to see production right away. Basically, I don't mind getting Jalen Reagor or Justin Jefferson after the previous guys in my rookie drafts. The real problem to me starts once those guys are off the board. Tier 5 and 6 are pretty similar to me. In fact, since my rankings were published, I switched some things around and have pretty much a giant Tier 5 now that includes Keyshawn Vaughn, Henry Ruggs, T. Higgins, Denzel Mims, Michael Pittman, Brandon Ayuk, and Laviska Shenault. I've already broken down these players in my pre-draft rankings episode. I don't want to bore you with similar information. Like I said, I think it's better to dig into strategy here and where my head's at with everything. That's probably why you guys are listening to this episode in the first place. If you're in win now mode, I don't know if T. Higgins is your pick. He was drafted as the AJ Green replacement, and he actually comps fairly well to AJ Green. But it might take some time for him to hit the field consistently. I still have my concerns about Henry Ruggs and his lack of production. And I have concerns about Brandon Ayuk's late breakout as well. But I think both guys found homes that can help them. Ruggs can walk into volume with the Raiders, and Ayuk is another yards after the catch monster that Kyle Shanahan can use in that offense. He'll find ways to get Ayuk the ball in space. Mims has intrigue for short-term production on a Jets team with a bad depth chart. And Laviska Shenault should be a good chess piece for the Jags. He continues to be a high variance pick. I've said a lot about these guys on shows in the past. So again, I don't want to go too deep into each of those players. Instead, I want to spend a little more time talking about Keyshawn Vaughn here. I had him listed at 17th overall in my pre-draft rankings, which was probably higher than most analysts. So of course I'm super amped that he landed in Tampa Bay. I don't have him higher than the big 4 wide receivers and the big 5 running backs in this class though. I see the downside with Vaughn. As a prospect, he was someone who did everything well, but not necessarily exceptionally well. He didn't wow you per se. And he's an older prospect, which doesn't help his cause. Now, I made a poll on Twitter last week asking people where they would rank DeAndre Swift if Swift was a 3rd rounder who was drafted by Tampa Bay. According to that poll, 28% of people would put DeAndre Swift with the Buccaneers at 101, and this is a 3rd rounder DeAndre Swift. 27% of them put him at the 102, 25% at the 103, and just 19% at the 104 or later. Now, I know those numbers don't equal 99%, but there were decimals involved. Let's just take these results as fact, that this is how people would rank DeAndre Swift as a 3rd rounder for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Think about what that means. It means that it's very clear that we care a lot about running back talent, and that our evaluations pre-draft matter a lot as well. Draft capital is important because it not only can tell us who might get immediate opportunity, but it can also tell us what a team or what teams thought about a player. Tyler Johnson fell in this draft. He can have this awesome stat score because of his college production, but because so many teams passed on Tyler Johnson multiple times, the probability that he's going to be great as an NFL wide receiver is pretty small. If teams passed on DeAndre Swift in the 2nd round and the Bucs got him where Keyshawn Vaughn was drafted, we should be asking questions. Just because we like DeAndre Swift going into the draft doesn't mean we shouldn't ask those questions post-draft. And I'd argue the reverse is true here too. Why did Van Jefferson go where he did? Or more related to this question, why did the Bucs want and get Keyshawn Vaughn? If DeAndre Swift would be your 101 or 102 or even 103 had he been drafted by the Bucs in the 3rd round, then I would hope that you have Keyshawn Vaughn higher than the consensus rank. I would hope that the logic that you use for Swift, which is really landing spot focused in this case, would also apply for Keyshawn Vaughn. And for the record, I'm not saying I agree. I actually wouldn't have Swift ahead of CEH, Taylor, or Dobbins if he landed in Tampa Bay as a 3rd rounder. And that's also why I have Vaughn in this tier and ranked him 10th overall. Swift would likely be my 104. So there'd still be a gap between Swift and Vaughn in my rankings if Swift was the Buccaneers' choice. But I think it's a good exercise to think about what we're really ranking here. Because in the end, we're going to be wrong about our evaluations on players. What if DeAndre Swift isn't that good in the NFL? What if he's not as good as we all think? What if Keyshawn Vaughn is better than people think? The talent discrepancy there, to me, shouldn't mean the difference between being the 101 and the 201. The difference between DeAndre Swift the player and Keyshawn Vaughn the player, to me, shouldn't mean a full round in rookie drafts and a hell of a lot more in opportunity cost. All of that is just some of the logic and reasoning why I think Vaughn makes sense as a late 1st and early 2nd round pick in rookie drafts. I liked him as a prospect, and I think that he can take on a pass catching role immediately for Tampa Bay. But he has the upside to do more on early downs as well. Now, after that giant tier 5, tier 6 includes 3 players, each playing 3 different positions. You've got Joe Burrow here, who would be the top pick in a superflex format, or one of the top picks. Now, generally speaking, I'm usually drafting quarterbacks based on need in single quarterback rookie drafts. I love Burrow, and I think he's going to be great. But the ranking of Burrow here has just as much to do with need as it does value. The wide receiver in this tier is Bryan Edwards. I wouldn't be shocked if Edwards, over the next few seasons, I wouldn't be shocked if he ends up taking over as the highest volume pass catcher for that Raiders offense. He's easily the guy who profiles to be the possession receiver on that team the most right now. He had an elite breakout age, though his college production was never unbelievable, but the breakout age was elite, and he was consistently productive for South Carolina. At 6'3", 212 pounds, he's the best bigger-bodied long-term solution that the Raiders currently have. So even though he's outside that big wide receiver tier, he's my favorite mid to late 2nd round pick that you can find. And at running back in tier 6, I have Zach Moss. I do think that we're looking at more of a David Montgomery type prospect with Moss, but he should be able to lock into that Frank Gore role in Buffalo right away. So he'll have the early down upside given Gore saw about 48% of Buffalo's running back rushes last year. And he should see some goal line work. Gore had 11 goal line attempts last season. Devin Singletary had 2. And again, guys, what if our player evaluation is just wrong? Keep in mind, in the range of outcomes for Moss is that he's really good and the Bills can't keep him off the field. One of his statistical comps was Kareem Hunt. Now, I like Singletary a lot, and given the way that they used him last year, he's going to be their satellite back plus moving forward. But Moss at least has that ambiguous upside and potential. Tier 7 starts with Tua, but again, drafting Tua should depend on need. I won't get into much detail there because he's a quarterback, and we know quarterbacks have less value in fantasy football. This tier, though, consists of a lot of secondary running backs who are probably walking into some sort of split backfield in year 1. The main reason I have Moss ahead of these guys is because of draft capital, opportunity, and where he ended up in my model, which wasn't bad. But it's not unlikely that we see 1, 2, or maybe 3 of these guys jump Moss in upcoming years. Now let's start with A.J. Dillon. Dillon got some chatter on last week's mailbag episode, and I sort of defended him for not being a totally worthless pass catcher. I doubt he's used heavily as a receiver in the NFL, and the comparison I made from a workload perspective is sort of an early career Derrick Henry light. I won't lie, my model doesn't mind A.J. Dillon given he has that second round draft capital. He ranked in the 81st percentile. It does give Keyshawn Vaughn the edge despite going later in the draft, but it's hard to ignore what the Packers spent to get Dillon and what they're aiming to do moving forward. The thing is, though, I don't think Dillon is a must-get running back in this tier. There are 3 other running backs that I'm pretty intrigued by. Anthony McFarland is one of them. The Steelers didn't get a running back on day 2, which is good for James Conner's potential in 2020. But he's a free agent next year, and they took McFarland, who's a great complementary piece to Conner, but they took him in the 4th. McFarland has speed. He ran a 4.44 40 at the combine. And while people may make the comment that he's undersized, his BMI is actually higher than Cam Akers and J.K. Dobbins. He's short, but he's not skinny. He shared a backfield in college with Javon Leake, who went undrafted to the Giants. But McFarland was the more productive back of the 2 in college, and he was used more as a receiver. That's what you like to see from a production standpoint, that he was able to beat out an NFL caliber player in college, and it explains some of his lower production metrics. So I like McFarland a lot. I liked him a lot heading into the draft. I think he has a chance to be sort of a deeper league flex play in year 1, but the upside is there for year 2 for when James Conner might not be a Pittsburgh Steeler. And then another 4th round running back in this draft that I'm into is Joshua Kelly. I've mentioned that he's pretty much going to be the Melvin Gordon replacement, or the guy who's going to step in and play that role. Anthony Lynn said as much as well. But on the roster, you've got Austin Eckler, who's great, but he hasn't been someone who's seen a huge early down workload. And then you have Justin Jackson, who I also like a lot, but he's undersized. Josh Kelly is not. He's 212 pounds, and he's a physical downhill runner. I don't love running backs who have their pass-catching ceilings capped, which is the main reason I give McFarland a slight edge over Kelly. Eckler is going to catch passes for the Chargers. But I do think Kelly will be the primary goal line back for the Chargers, potentially right away. I think he was a great pick for the Gordon replacement. Now, I think McFarland and Kelly are pretty safe bets without crazy high ceilings. If you're looking for ceiling in this tier and you don't care that much about the floor, then your man is Antonio Gibson. He's another guy that I talked about on last week's mailbag show, but Gibson is a freak. He had a 99th percentile speed score, and his efficiency numbers at Memphis were out of control, you guys. He averaged 19.3 yards per reception and 11.2 yards per attempt last year. But that was on 38 receptions and just 33 attempts. Why didn't Memphis use him more? Sometimes that happens. Teams don't use players as much as we'd like, even though those players are really good. But we also know that college production does correlate and translate to the NFL at both running back and wide receiver. That's why Gibson is a high-risk, high-reward bet in rookie drafts. I don't really mind the Washington depth chart at running back, both in the short and long term. Geis hasn't stayed healthy, and they wouldn't have taken Gibson at the top of the 3rd round if they had zero plan for him. Gibson has a chance to just be better. I mean, Gibson has a chance to be one of the best running backs in this class, if we're being honest. We just don't know enough about what type of workload he can handle and what happens when he sees a ton of volume. But that's the beauty of this class. There's so much talent that the opportunity cost in getting Antonio Gibson is not very high. So if you're in a position where you don't need an immediate piece for your dynasty team, Gibson's a perfect pick. And there's still a chance that he sees a decent year one role. I only mean this from the perspective that Gibson has a low floor because of all the question marks surrounding his profile. Now, I've got 3 guys in tier 8, and like tier 6, they all play different positions. Justin Herbert is the quarterback here, and to reiterate for the 3rd time, it's more of a need-based thing if you go with Herbert. Analytically, he looks like the obvious 3rd best quarterback in this class. Tua and Burrow both look stronger. But the situation that Herbert's falling into isn't the worst one, and he's still not a bad prospect. So if you need a quarterback, this is where I would consider Herbert. Darrynton Evans is the running back in this tier. I'm really intrigued by this landing spot. I think a lot of people will shut him down as anything relevant because Derrick Henry is in Tennessee, and that's who drafted Darrynton Evans. But Evans is a speedster who ran a 4.4 140. He makes for a perfect change of pace back to Derrick Henry. And if you recall, back in February, I talked about Henry's workload regressing moving forward and into the 2020 season. Since 2011, we've had 35 instances where a running back carried the ball 280 or more times in a season. That's an arbitrary number, but it's still far fewer than Henry's 303 from last year. 30 of those 35 running backs have relevant next season data. And of those 30, only one player, Marshawn Lynch, was able to increase his attempt number the following year. Now, why is that? Part of it is just natural regression. Teams may not be leading as much, and they may not be able to just hand the ball off like they want to. Part of it is probably injury related too. But what we know is that a ton of volume one year doesn't mean that that player will match that volume the next year. In other words, Darrynton Evans could have some sort of role in this offense as a rookie. And what happens if Derrick Henry is out of Tennessee after 2020? He's playing on the franchise tag. What if he doesn't actually get a contract? All of a sudden, Evans is in a really good spot. Now, the wide receiver in this tier is Chase Claypool. I really wanted Claypool to land on a team where they'd use him as a tight end because he had that potential then to make sort of an Evan Ingram type impact. But the Steelers have said that they want to play him on the outside, which I'm not a huge fan of. He just seems like someone who tests a lot better than he plays. And don't get me wrong, his athletic testing was awesome. But when you watch Claypool, he doesn't look like a wideout who's going to consistently win and create separation in the NFL. I'm just not a big fan of Claypool, the wide receiver. And neither is my model really, despite his draft capital. He ranked in the 79th percentile, which was nothing special for a second round pick. And it's a fringe percentile ranking for hits in my model. I like to see 80th percentile wide receivers at least. But I'm open to being wrong. My scouting isn't flawless by any means. That's why I'm still cool with you taking him at the end of the 2nd round or the beginning of the 3rd round of rookie drafts if he's there. Now, this final tier of players that I'm going to talk about today, tier 9, I only brought up 3 of them in my rankings article over on Numberfire. I had Antonio Gandy-Golden, then KJ Hamler, and then Devin Duvernay to close up my top 30. I think Gandy-Golden has a shot to see a lot of work right away. He's the size that Washington kind of needs in that passing attack. His production profile was predictably really good since he went to a small school, but it was also really good, which is necessary from that type of program. Now, I worry about KJ Hamler's size a little bit because he's only 176 pounds, but we know that he has speed. He's likely just as fast or about as fast as Henry Ruggs. But Hamler, to me, profiles as a better real-life football player than a fantasy one because of that size-speed combo. He may open things up more for Cortland Sutton and Jerry Jeudy than be a standalone fantasy value out of the slot for Denver. I like Devin Duvernay's landing spot, and I wouldn't fault anyone for drafting him earlier than where I ranked him. The Ravens can use him immediately in the slot and get the speed that they want in that offense. He ran a 4.39 40, and he saw a huge bump in production last year when he started to play in the slot more for Texas. I think he's a great fit for Baltimore. But like any receiver in Baltimore, we have to be somewhat worried about passing volume. So those were my players in my top 30. But in my last tier, if I had written about one more player, it would be Van Jefferson. And I want to end today's show talking about him because I think that he, as an example, can wrap up my fantasy football philosophy pretty well. Jefferson's production and analytical profile sucks. I mean, that's just honesty. It's terrible. He's got a late breakout age. He's got crap college production. Everything that I've talked about on this show over the last couple of months that matter for wide receiver prospects, Van Jefferson does not have. But then he goes and he gets drafted in the 2nd round of the NFL draft to the Rams with Denzel Mims still on the board. The fantasy community didn't love Jefferson heading into the draft because the fantasy community is largely numbers based. Say what you want about analysts or people not paying enough attention to numbers. This community as a whole absolutely favors number-based analysis more than teams and scouts do. And it makes sense as to why. Fantasy football is a game about numbers. We're worried about numbers. How a player impacts the rest of his team matters very little to us if it means that player is not seeing production. So we can model for that. And we can aim to target specific players who fit a certain mold. It makes sense for us to be super numbers based. But here's the key takeaway that I try to talk about as much as I possibly can on this show, because it's the single most important thing to winning in fantasy football. Fantasy football is just as much about the market as it is player evaluation. With player evaluation, you're not automatically right. You're wrong almost just as much as you're right when it comes to fringe players. So the other input that you should be paying attention to is the market, where guys are getting drafted. And I mean, you should be heavily paying attention to the market. If you really like a guy, but everyone else also really likes that guy, then you're not really gaining that much of an advantage by drafting that player, since you know that you can also be wrong. And then the opposite is true too. If you really dislike a player and everyone else really dislikes that player, completely fading that player doesn't necessarily help you out. Especially when that player was a second-round wide receiver draft selection in one of the best wide receiver classes of the last decade. I don't need to like Van Jefferson the player to draft Van Jefferson, because variance is a thing. I'm going to be wrong. And there's at least one significant input, which is draft capital, that favors Van Jefferson. So while the fantasy community is rightfully down on the player given his analytical profile, I'm also recognizing and trying to take advantage of the fact that the fantasy community is also analytically driven. There's at least some bias there. And that's why Jefferson went from, I'm never going to draft this guy, to, holy crap, I can get a second round pick in the late third and sometimes early fourth round of rookie drafts. That's why Van Jefferson matters. I'm playing the market, not just player evaluation. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll have a rewind episode for you on Wednesday, so I'll talk to you then.